There. Um, I want to record this video so that I can do some kind of catching you guys up because, as I think I've mentioned before, this course picks up in the year 1200, whereas your textbook was written literally starting with the Big Bang. And so for Unit 1, I'm going to record for you once a week an overview video that tries to give you a little bit of background so that when you jump into reading about Song China this week or whatever it is in the next few weeks, you won't be totally disoriented. The first thing that I want to say about China is that the picture of Chinese history expands well beyond the parameters of this course. That's true for basically everything we talk about. This course, by necessity, has to be an overview. I can't teach you literally everything that happened in the last 820 years. But for China, that's especially obvious because Chinese history, Chinese civilization, and the Chinese sort of identity, the concept of China extends so much further back into history than this course, than the time frame of the AP World course. So if I represent this pictorially with this timeline that some great person on the internet put together, the first thing you want to know is that when we talk about Chinese history up until the last 100 years or so, we often use the term dynasty to refer to different periods and political regimes in China. A dynasty just means a sequence of rulers from the same family. So when we talk about the Han Dynasty in Chinese history, we're just referring to a period, both a group of people who ruled China for 400 some years and to the period over which they ruled China. And so, just to get you a little bit oriented to the broad scope of Chinese history, try and get you a sense of exactly how much history there is that we're just skipping directly past. If I start here about 3,500 years ago, around the year 1500 BCE, we have the first preserved writing that gives us evidence of a Chinese language and civilization, although that writing itself refers to older events that may or may not have happened. We just don't have as much of a documentary or physical record for those events. If I fast forward a few 100 years, then we'll get to the period in which two people that I'll talk about a little bit later in this video lived, named Confucius and Lao Tzu, two of the most important philosophers in Chinese history. Fast forward to the Qin dynasty, about 2,200 years ago, give or take, and you see the emergence of a third philosophy that I'm going to talk about today, which is legalism. The Qin dynasty is frequently marked as sort of the beginning of China in its modern incarnation, but we will see China be kind of dissolved and reformed, and its borders will change and political structures will change over the course of the next 2,400 years. In the Han Dynasty, which follows the relatively short-lived Qin Dynasty, the belief system of Confucianism is really adopted and embraced as the guiding philosophy of the state, and I'll talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. Fast forward a couple hundred years after that, and Buddhism will show up in China from its origins in India, and I'll talk about that later today as well. The Song Dynasty is really the first dynasty that we're going to explicitly discuss in this course because it rules. It's what's ruling in China as of the year 1200, where we officially pick up. So I've already cut out 3,000 years of Chinese history or so just by starting AP World in 1200, as the College Board dictates. And for comparison, just an image to scale, all of United States history fits in that relatively tiny chunk of less than 300 years. So Americans are generally prone to sort of thinking that things are old when actually by the standards of, say, Asia or Europe or the Muslim world, they're really quite new. And I just want to alert you to the fact that there is so much more Chinese history than I think most Americans are prepared to conceptualize, especially if you're coming out of AP US history and you're kind of inclined to think like, wow, 1800 I studied that in October. It's a really long time ago. So that's your broad timeline. If you are thinking, gosh, there's a lot of dynasties. I wish I had some sort of mnemonic for remembering the order in which they went. Boy, I have a solution to your problems. And I'm going to proceed to do something so ridiculous that my neighbors will probably knock on the windows and laugh at me as I record this video. That's okay. I do it every semester when I teach AP World. All my past students should be able to sing you this song if you just ask them very nicely to do it. And so I am not willing to abandon that tradition just because I can't bring you into a physical classroom and make you sing it in person. All right. I can't put this off any longer. Here we go. The Chinese dynasty song goes as follows. 上周秦汉，上周秦汉，隋唐宋，隋唐宋， Yuanmingqing Republic, Mao Zedong. And you just have to imagine that I am making you all stand up in the classroom and sing that, because doing it alone at your computer, while valuable, is not going to bring you anywhere near the necessary amount of humiliation to properly learn this in class. All right. Having thus done the most ridiculous thing that I'm going to do probably in the month of September, let's talk about sort of three categories of key concepts that you need to know in order for your reading of Chapter 8 in Robert Strayer's book to really make much sense. First thing I want to talk about real briefly is philosophies and belief systems. And I think it's chapter 3 of your textbook that contains a lot more detail on these things if you want to delve deeper. I'll also put in the Unit 1 schedule some supplemental resources if you want to learn more about any or all of these belief systems. And I just want to note, I'm using the term belief system as a slightly broader term for religion. I'll use those terms interchangeably in this course. But I'm going to refer to the following, these three of the classical Chinese traditions as belief systems rather than religions, because they're not theistic, they don't worship a specific god, but they do inform how people understand the way that the universe works. The first of those is called legalism, and that's really almost more of a governing philosophy than it is sort of a metaphysical theory. That originates in the Qin dynasty, something like 2,200 years ago, and it's going to emphasize that people are bad. That's the fundamental assumption underlying legalism, and that they need to be punished in order to make the state work, to keep the state orderly, to stop people from ruining everything with their selfish behavior. That's legalism. It is the philosophy of the Qin dynasty, which unifies the first thing that's really recognizable as modern China. You will be not super shocked to learn that because of all its harsh punishments, it's not super popular, and the Qin dynasty doesn't last super long, only 2 emperors. Confucianism turns out to have a much longer lasting impact on China, and it's embraced by the Han Dynasty, which succeeds the Qin Dynasty, and by many, many Chinese rulers afterwards. You can argue that Confucianism continues to have some amount of influence on Chinese politics even today. Even after all of the upheaval of the 20th century, you can still tease out some strands of Confucianism in China's contemporary politics, but I teach a different class about that. Confucianism emerges, the philosopher Confucius, the founder of Confucianism, emerges from this period called the Warring States period, in which there's a bunch of, China isn't politically unified. There's a bunch of different regional warlords and princes kind of fighting over control of China. And Confucius is very concerned with the problem of how we can restore order in China and how a prince should govern in order to be able to restore political stability. The answer that Confucius embraces is that society is ordered hierarchically. Everybody has a different role. And the way that we maintain order in society is by knowing our role, fulfilling the expectations of our role, performing the proper obedience to the people who are above us in life, looking out for the people who are below us in life, and honoring those hierarchical, unequal relationships. Ritual is a big part of that. And Confucianism in that way will actually manage to embrace some pre-Confucian rituals, such as honoring ancestors, venerating ancestors, that had been popularly practiced in China for a long, long time. And most importantly, Confucius is targeting a lot of his advice at rulers, at people who would, if they could, control all of China. And what he says is that if you want to maintain political stability, you have to set an example of morally correct behavior. So he's not egalitarian. He's not necessarily about leveling the distinction between emperors and peasants, but he does say that everybody needs to perform according to the moral standard of behavior that governs their station in society. The other thing that's important about Confucianism is that it really emphasizes the importance of education, that you can learn to behave properly, that you can learn to behave morally and ethically if you study these texts, if you read these writings of Confucius and commentators on his work. And so you'll see a huge emphasis on education in periods of Chinese history where Confucianism is the dominant belief system. Third system is Taoism. Taoism, founded by the sage Lao Tzu, emerges actually in roughly the same period as Confucianism, but it's almost a polar opposite. Taoism says Actually, all of this trying is kind of a waste. All of this emphasis on structure and ritual and organization and your station in life is really going in the wrong direction. Instead, the way to achieve order is for people to return to nature. And there are actually Taoist practitioners throughout Chinese history who literally just kind of abandon everything and wander off into the mountains. And so you'll see lots of strands in Chinese history that really emphasize nature and appreciating the natural world. Taoism is really kind of a more mystical, abstract philosophy. If you try to read the Tao Te Ching, which is the foundational text of Taoism, you'll find all of these kind of paradoxical sounding sayings like the way which can be named is not the way. But it really emphasizes kind of the unknowability of truth, and therefore really encourages this kind of life of inward looking contemplation. So Taoism and Confucianism point in different directions, but it's actually important to note that it's entirely possible to try and do both at the same time. And there are actually plenty of important individuals in Chinese history who use Confucianism as the best way to administer a just society when they're looking outwards into the world, but who also engage in these Taoist practices like contemplating nature in order to try and achieve sort of inner peace. Last thing that needs to be mentioned, and this one's different because it doesn't originate in China, which will become important later, is Buddhism. Buddhism emerges in the context of these kind of classical Indian beliefs, which will later cohere into something that we now know as Hinduism. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in this course. But what you need to know right now is that Buddhism really rejects materialism and says that the root of suffering is desire. So Buddhism has, in common with Taoism, some degree of sort of rejection of the material world, and exhortation of its followers to turn away from politics, to stop trying so hard at everything. And you might be able to predict already that those impulses can sometimes be kind of threatening to political rulers who really want people to stay in society, work hard, fulfill their role, keep the system running. So Buddhism will arrive in China from India. It's founded in India, but it actually really doesn't gain as much of a foothold there as you might predict based on where it originates. And it's, again, important to remember that those foreign origins of Buddhism from the Chinese perspective will sometimes be cause for suspicion and criticism and persecution of Buddhists. All right, that's the sort of cultural angle that we needed to talk about. The second thing we need to talk about is in the theme of politics, and that is how do these Chinese rulers build their states? Obviously, there's lots of differences between different dynasties and different rulers, and how politics is implemented in different parts and periods of Chinese history. But a couple of constants that are important to understand. Number one, essentially, in periods of unity, there are periods of disunity and civil war, but in periods of unity up until the 20th century, China is ruled by emperors, so one monarch at a time, who are grouped, as I said earlier, into hereditary dynasties. You're looking at an image of Qin Shi Huang, who is the first emperor of the Qin dynasty in China, who has one of the best hats. In general, Chinese emperors have the best hats. I will show you way too many examples over the next semester. The rule of those emperors is considered to be absolute, and it's supported by this uniquely Chinese concept known as the mandate of heaven. What the mandate of heaven says in good times, when things are going well in China, is that the emperor was put on the throne by heaven, not a personalized god, but this kind of abstract concept of heaven as the ordering force in the universe. And that justifies his claim to power. The emperor is often perceived as the son of heaven, so sort of a representative of this greater moral force in the universe on earth. And so in good times, if things are going well, that's a sign that heaven has sort of smiled on the emperor, has blessed him with the power to rule, and therefore you really better do what he says. On the other hand, that mandate of heaven concept is really a double-edged sword, because once things start going poorly, people start looking around and saying, actually, it really looks as if the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven, as if heaven no longer favors this emperor, or perhaps even this entire dynasty, this whole ruling family, and maybe it's time for a political change. And so often at the end of a dynasty or at the end of an emperor's reign in China, you'll start to see things like floods or famines be interpreted by the general public as a sign that the emperor has lost the mandate of heaven. Third political concept is that obviously the emperor can't run around China collecting all of the taxes and administering all of the laws and judging all of the family disputes himself. And so he administers the empire through an extensive bureaucracy, which is the term that we use for people who work for the state. Those members of that bureaucracy, starting from the Han Dynasty, are selected through an exam system. In other words, China is really a pioneer dating back 2,000 plus years in the use of standardized testing. Those exams are known as the civil service exams, and they vary from dynasty to dynasty. But in general, what they do is test a person's knowledge of Confucian texts, meaning that if you want this prestigious, well paid government job, you need to spend years, sometimes decades, studying Confucian texts and the commentaries on them, sometimes learning to recite them, learning to write essays about them, in some cases, learning to write poetry and to do painting, which are all sort of endorsed as appropriate pursuits for the scholarly class in Confucian ideology. And so knowledge of Confucian texts really becomes a route to social mobility and to power in much of Chinese history. That leads me into my final point for today, which is to talk about Chinese social structure. Classical Confucian ideology endorses the idea of a hierarchy of essentially four classes. I'm going to go from the highest to the lowest in that ideology. The highest class is the civil servants. Shockingly, Confucianism seems to endorse the idea that people who know a lot about Confucius's works are really the best people. And so, for much of Chinese history, government employees, civil servants, members of the bureaucracy have this exalted status and a much more comfortable position, with obviously the emperor at the very, very top of that hierarchy. Second from there is landlords, so people who often by virtue of their families, connections and wealth, own a lot of land, rent it out to peasant farmers, and as a consequence have the leisure to live a really luxurious life and to spend a bunch of time studying those Confucian classics. That's why sometimes in Chinese history we refer to that land-owning class as the scholar gentry. Gentry meaning you're a wealthy landowner, you have this life of luxury. Scholar meaning that you have spent a bunch of time reading those Confucian texts, even if you didn't necessarily pass the civil service exam. So that's the next class down. Third down is the peasant farmers. Peasant is a term you're going to hear over and over and over again in world history. For most societies, for most of time, peasants are the vast majority, assuming it's a society that practices settled agriculture. And peasant farmers are the vast majority of China's population for most of its history. The peasants in Confucian ideology, they're poor, right? The material circumstances of their life are certainly not enviable. They're not super comfortable. Some of them will own a little bit of land and be able to eke out a living, maybe have a little extra to sell at market. Some of them will just be tenant farmers who have basically no control or no power and are constantly on the edge of poverty and dispossession. But in Confucian ideology, the one thing you have going for you as a peasant is that you're doing something fundamentally useful. There's some amount of honor attached, at least in principle, to those peasant farmers because they're doing the thing that allows us all to stay alive. Worse than the peasants, lowlier than the peasants, are the merchant class, people who just buy and sell stuff for a living. And in classical Confucian ideology, merchants are sort of morally worthless because they don't actually make anything useful. They just profit from the labor of others. One thing that you'll see when you do your chapter 8 reading over the next couple of days is that the status of merchants materially, the amount of wealth that they actually have, the amount of comfort that they're able to achieve, might actually exceed their social status under Confucian ideology, because as China becomes more and more of a commercial market economy, merchants are able to achieve more and more importance in society. And so you'll start to see that ideological construct about social classes start to fall apart as merchants become indispensable to China's prosperity. For the most part, you're born into these three classes. If your parent is a peasant, you're quite likely to be a peasant farmer. But one important quirk in China's system that isn't necessarily paralleled in other classical societies is that the civil service exam system creates the possibility of social mobility for people who are born in a lower class to work their way up by studying really hard. You will, of course, recognize some echoes of that in the way that we talk about standardized testing in college admissions today in the US. Whether or not it's true is a question we can discuss at some other time. And so, in principle, it is possible to move up in the world by virtue of working really hard. In practice, as is the case in the United States in 2020, the richer your family is, the better education you're going to have access to. All right. I've done belief systems, I've done political structures, and I've talked about social classes a little bit. That's it for our backgrounds. Go forth and finish your chapter 8 reading, and we will talk about this stuff soon. Thanks.